Woo! Saturday, Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk, educated educators talking education. Dr. Tim Slekar, Dr. Johnny Lupinacci, and chairman of the board, producer Jacob. There he is. Jacob, come on. That's how we need you to be introduced right there, man, with gusto and authority, because there is no other chairman of the board.
Well, Tim, I'm producer Jacob, and I said it with authority, and I'm glad to be here. Really appreciate you inviting me on to continue doing the thing I do on every show.
Well, we appreciate you. And hey, everybody, civic media, particularly driving around on a Saturday somewhere in Wisconsin, maybe up in Minocqua, getting a beer at the Minocqua Brewery. Say hi to our friends up there. We like the Minocqua Brewery. Maybe you're up in Ashland, hanging out on Lake Superior. Hey, maybe you're even in Racine.
Some people are.
Some people are in Racine. Here's the deal. We love that you're listening to Busted Pencils on civic media, either radio stations, on the app, however you get to it. And Jacob, we're in Michigan now and Minnesota, right?
Why, Tim, that is correct. We are in Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. If it has an M or an upside down M to start it off, pretty soon we're going to be in all those states.
Well, there you go. So, wow, civic media is growing. Johnny, this is pretty cool when you think about this, right? The trip, because when we were doing Busted Pencils and it was there, and our man Luke was our producer. It was what was it? Just mad radio, right?
I loved it. Yeah,
Madison.
It's growing, man. It's like growing like a chia pet all the way across the state, growing like kudzu all over the place.
Well, I mean, it's truly becoming a Midwest
That's
type
great.
of, and the expansion. But I appreciate the fact that, we got to be there when it was, that little radio station in Madison and a little radio station in Milwaukee. And we were doing Busted Pencils live every Tuesday night, and we were there for the emergence of what is now civic media and truly becoming a just an incredible voice in the Midwest, bringing democracy, local radio programming to all of those little towns that are there. So hey, if it sounds like I'm kissing civic media's butt, I might be.
Hey, man, just pumping their tires. Big fans. I mean, it's local radio refreshed. And I love the idea of local on top of local on top of local on top of local. Because when you connect small democracies together, well, golly, there you have it. The kind of democracy that we're advocating for all the time here. And so it's exciting to have listenership locally and thinking about local in a couple of different contexts.
Yeah, there's just this whole idea of local. I mean, the concept, and Johnny and I we were like excited. It was like, wait, civic media, advocation of democracy. Like, holy crap, we fit right in. This is great. And here we are now. So if you're out in Minnesota, if you're in Michigan too, hey, welcome to Busted Pencils. What do we do on Busted Pencils? We do not talk about blackboards, chalkboards, bulletin boards, and what kind of crayons are better than others. They're like, this is a teacher show. No. Hey, we kind of contextualize education, the things that are happening at your public school or should be happening at your public school, so that you are informed, knowing what's going on, and potentially talking to your neighbor about what's happening in your public schools. Because more than anything, what Johnny and I really want to do is have a conversation to be able for you to go out and continue those conversations with your neighbors locally. Because, yeah, if we're anything, we are 100% advocates of public schools from the framing of democracy, but we also will, when required, let you know that a lot of sometimes the things that go on in public schools, particularly when it comes to teaching and learning. Johnny and I are going to be there to call out sometimes things that aren't really that great. So, I mean, John, right? We're I know I'm on a little tangent here, but
No, it's great. I mean, you're kind of refreshing,
yeah,
the listener out there to what the radio show's about. Educated educators talking education. I think, Tim, we are also a show for teachers, so we do
yeah.
kind of time straight into that. I kind of like to think of us, Tim, as car talk, but for the show Car Talk on
Oh yeah.
NPR, Click and Clack. We're like Click and Clack of the public education world, higher education, elementary education, middle school, high school, all those things. But especially, like you said, Tim, public education as a bedrock of democracy. We are both teachers. We had
Mhm.
a great career of teaching, parlayed that into becoming teacher educators, education researchers. So when we joke around, it's not really a joke, but when we throw that tagline out there, educated educators talking education, that's exactly what this
That's
show
what
is. And the thing about the show that's exciting, Tim, is you know there's always something going on related to education in our communities, in our schools, in our own learning, because like learning is a lifetime task. So we're always just chopping it up, talking, putting a lot of hot air out there for our listeners. But that's a great way to kind of refresh. If it has anything to do with schools, sometimes it's like policy or legislation. Other times it's budget stuff. Sometimes it's just talking about school practices, maybe about high stakes testing,
yeah.
what they've done to our classrooms, or things like that, or like the change in teacher labor because of AI. That's been a big topic
Oh,
lately. We've talked a lot about, but you name it, if it's being talked about in education, well, Click and Clack here. Well, not actually.
no.
Dr. Tim Slekar, Dr. Johnny Lupinacci, and Jacob, chairman of the board. We're here talking about it all week long, and our weekly podcast drops,
Yes.
but then also on the wonderful, you're listening to it now, Saturday broadcast. So we love being here at Civic Media and doing that. So yeah, if it's related to education, well, we're talking about it. Gonna
Well,
throw it in and chew on that.
I love that. And, yeah, a little refresh here today for, particularly any of the new listeners out in those new
Any
markets.
newbies, any,
Yeah,
any new pencil busters out there?
well, just think though, if you're out there in Michigan or Minnesota, first time you're listening, just understand this. There are people listening with you in Finland. So just putting that out there. You're
All over the place, because you can download these podcasts or you can listen from anywhere on the Civic Media app. So yeah, we've got friends and colleagues teaching all around the world, that we get to talk with often, and bring some of those topics into the show as well. So always lots of surprises, always lots of great guests. Tim, now that we've refreshed things, let's
okay.
let's talk about the week, man. What's your
Well,
guys' week has
okay.
been like?
Here's
Summertime, fellas. It's summertime.
yeah, it's summer, it's hot, it's all those things. But what I do though too is every Thursday morning, I'm a guest on the John and Gordy show out of the Madison station, and we kind of do a recap what's going on in Busted Pencils, and we got onto this topic of big headlines out there. Columbia paying out 220 million dollars as Johnny, help me if I'm wrong here, but as a fine in violation of Title 10,
No, 6, but
Title 6. Okay, so a violation of Title 6. So what's happening here on the face is Columbia is saying yes, we violated Title 6. Here's 220 million. Sorry, I don't know. Okay. What is Title 6? How is that? What did Columbia do? We're going to talk a lot about that today in a way that hopefully we can get some deeper understanding as instead of the polarization that I think is really going on around this, that is creating a kind of push against higher education to the standpoint of where we might actually create in higher education something at the end of the day that we don't really want. And what we really want is more freedom And what's happening here might not really be an indicator for more freedom. And John, I'm just going to point this out and contextualize this. So back in 2007, 2008, I I brought in a guest speaker to my campus there, and you know, great educator, was bringing him in to talk about education. And next thing you know, I got a call from the academic office saying, did you invite so and so to campus?" And I said, "Well, yeah, he's like an awesome educator. He's got a great book out there. He's a great speaker. Did you know what he did in the past?" And I went, um, I mean, he was a Vietnam War pro. He did more than protest. He blew stuff up, Tim. We're talking about Bill Ayers, Johnny, who's been on our show a few times.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
good friend of Bill's. Yeah.
and I had invited him to campus, and it was, polarizing in this local rural community of Pennsylvania that I was bringing in this, according to the critique of people who were saying he's a devout Marxist, potentially communist,
This is
anti
hilarious.
anti-American, and in fact, as being part of the Weather Underground, actually was a terrorist. And how could this institution support bringing a terrorist to campus? Well, guess what we did? We brought this person to campus. And guess what happened when they came to campus? There were protests of people standing out there, and they had protests, and people showed up, and Bill came, and Bill talked for an hour. And some of those people who actually came in to hear him say the things, they came ready. In fact, there was a group of 3 guys, seriously, in the back, had just come back from duck hunting. They're in their camouflage clothes, and they wanted to challenge him on his right to speak because of what he had done. And within 15 minutes or so, there was a conversation between Bill Ayers and these 3 duck hunters. And when it came to, they looked at me and said, "He's actually pretty good on education. I think we have something that we can agree on." And so what happened there was a lot of people got really uptight about who was coming to campus, potentially even, but it was a protest. People protested peacefully. People showed up and spoke. We didn't shut him down. I'm kind of thinking that's a model of what we should be doing. And is that, have we gone too far? 220 million, a lot to unpack here.
Yeah,
But
Tim, I got a lot to respond to when we come back, man,
yeah,
because you served up a whole cornucopia of things, man.
a lot
I
of
gotta-
going on. Yeah, busted pencils though, fully leaded education talk. We'll be right back. Ooh, yeah. Busted pencils, fully leaded education talk. Educated educators talking education. For all the civic media listeners right now, it is Saturday. For all you downloaders, it's whatever day it is. We appreciate you. Like us, leave us a comment, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're else, actually too, iHeart podcast listeners. I know there are some of you out there. You can find us on the iHeart podcast station too, just in case. I didn't even know that, guys, until I found us on the web listed in the iHeart directory of podcasts. So I
Hey, Tim, it's why we say at the end of every show, wherever it is you get your podcast, you can find us. Tim, in the first part, the first segment of, this broadcast, though, you got into a couple of
Ah,
different things, man. And let's tease them apart a little bit because I think they're related, right? You were talking about that you were sharing a story of bringing Bill Ayers, who is I would say, a radical activist. I don't even necessarily know if that's the accurate term. That might raise alarm for folks, and kind of spark the kinds of protests that you had on your campus. But I'd say he's far left
Mhm.
in thinking radically about democracy and about peace, really, and stemming out of an era of anti-war protest and student organizing around democracies, particularly in the Midwest where a lot of our listeners are. So in Detroit and Chicago and amongst laborers, and it sparked kind of an interesting dynamic on your campus. And you were talking about that also related to this week's news about Colombia. And so I want to tease these two things apart because I think they're related. We've had conversations about freedom of speech and about the difference between freedom of speech and hate speech.
Mm.
Right. And so, especially in a democracy and thinking about universities are a characteristic of strong democracies around the world. They're sort of a signifier. If we're to say, is a government a democratic government or is a nation democratic, we would look to see things like a free university. I don't mean free like it's no payment to go there. I mean like free speech and the free thought of ideas on campuses, which means, sometimes you might not agree with those ideas, but that's an important value, right? In freedom and liberty, especially in academic freedom, as a signifier of a strong democracy, the free flow and exchange of ideas. Now, that also goes along with to be done in a nonviolent conflict kind of way. Disagreement can be conflict. We can
Mhm.
vehemently disagree about topics. Say maybe we have, a capitalist economics professor talking, and a Keynesian economics professor, or maybe even something like Marxist, him like you.
No.
I'm just teasing, or like people thought Bill Ayers was. But this idea around like having different viewpoints that could be radically opposed to one another, but insurance that violent conflict isn't, the standard of this. And so free speech and hate speech sort of sometimes get a little blurry between each other because on university campuses, actually in public spaces, hate speech is not tolerated,
Mm.
right? And especially in learning environments like universities, hate speech crosses the line of free speech. So once you cross into the murky area of being really closely connected to suggesting violence against people, against any particular group of people, right, or harm or hurt or fear or like all those kinds of threats that are actually connected to the unsafe environment
Yeah.
for students or for people working in that environment or attending. You've crossed over from free speech into hate speech, and hate speech is not allowed. It's not permissible on our campuses, nor in our public spaces. And so that's why I would say like apples and oranges in terms of some of the things that Colombia is dealing with. And we're going to unpack that in a minute because that's a whole rat's nest of stuff this week too, that I think overall has a bigger theme, Tim, that we got to get into with our listeners here. But the idea that, Bill Ayers coming, having a really different idea about what schools ought to be and what they are doing in our communities, and how equal education for all kids is really important. Do we care about children? Should we care about all children? Because right now in schools we kind of haven't been caring so much about poor working class or black and brown children in schools. And so Bill Ayers is very vocal about those kinds of things related to education and about democracy and human rights, and so his views may be different than say conservatives in education. They Neither of those groups has the right to cross over into sort of hate speech. And I think the stuff related to Colombia, I'm not going to get into the details, but I think across our campuses around this, country, and Tim, you and I got to be at the UW Madison
Yeah.
protests. And in fact, not that we are protesting at them. We happened to be at the John and Gordy show
We
one
we
morning, and we
we were
walked down.
we were journalists.
Yeah. So we were kind of just, just witnesses to a younger generation to see seemingly in a peaceful protest on a college campus. We don't have all the details of that, but that was happening around the country, Tim. And I think by and large, everything I witnessed, not only in Madison, but on other college campuses, didn't cross over into hate speech that I knew that I could like easily identify as that. However, this is a complex context in terms of if somebody says they feel unsafe, are they truly unsafe? And so, Jewish students felt unsafe on Columbia's campus. I'm not going to say they weren't. So this is one of those areas, I think, apples and oranges related to the Bill Ayers thing. Having these conversations on our campuses have gotten complex. And when we come back, let's dive right into, though, kind of this Columbia payout settlement deal, because I think it's indicator of a bigger issue going on.
Busted Pencils.
Hey, take your head off the dashboard. Don't hit it that hard. Busted Pencils, fully leaded education talk. Educated educators, talking education. Dr. Tim Slekar, me, Dr. Johnny Lupinacci, Jacob, chairman of the board, producer. Here we are, breaking it down, bringing, a, trying to take a very complex, detail rich, emotionally laden topic and trying to help make more sense of it as best we can. And Johnny, and maybe my story didn't really work out the way I had intended, and that's fine. We could try that another time. Because what you were saying though, what's happening and what should happen, and hate speech versus free speech, you know, that's what's at the heart of what's happening. So I'm going to ask this question, Johnny, and say, so what we know are the facts as best we can find facts, not alternative facts, but our best, sourcing, and we could go back and forth on this. But Columbia paid out $200 million in response to a Department of Education, Department of Justice probe into anti-Semitism, and therefore paid out $200 because this was considered a Title VI violation. However, Columbia paid this out with also no admission that they had done anything wrong.
And Tim, if I could add, and I think
Go ahead,
John,
Jacob.
you're
Yeah.
thinking the same thing. We should say that the settlement for $200 million seems to have been in response to kind of wrapping up a number of different things that were being looked into. And
Yeah.
again, as Johnny, we were talking about in the break, the statement from Columbia did not admit guilt. And so it's a little bit muddied as to what you can take away from it, clearly, from what Columbia wants to say about their role in this situation.
Yeah.
And they got $400 million in grants back restored to them.
Yeah.
So this is a thing, Tim, I think it's important to get into. Is there's, we've talked about it, we've covered, the Trump administration and the Harvard story a bit on here. And, Harvard is doing the opposite thing as Columbia in this sense. They're kind of digging in, saying you'll get none and we'll do what we're going to do. And, the Trump administration says, well, then you'll get the full wrath of what we have coming. Columbia's at the table, and I'm making jokes about it because it's actually quite serious, but let's have a little fun with it. There's a little book out there, Tim. I think you recommended it to me, The Art of the Deal. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But this is a kind, it kind of reads to me as a kind of negotiation kind of tactic. It's like, remember in history class, Tim, when we learned about, walk softly but carry a big stick.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of presidential approach to doing politics historically. But this is more of a like walk loudly, carry many big sticks and spiked bats, and meet your, you know, adversary or even potential ally as they are an adversary, and then kind of, you know, duke it out and settle things as you go blow for blow. Because what you have here is, you know, there are several investigations into Colombia, not only Colombia, but institutions of higher ed targeted by the Trump administration right now for a number of different, you know, I guess I'll call them like infractions related to, you know, those kind of top down, you know, a letter to a colleague kind of
Mm.
things we got back in January
Yeah,
and
yeah,
February.
yeah.
You remember? So there were all these things that the Trump administration immediately went into action saying that, you know, all institutions of education had to follow the following kinds of, you know, elimination of DI, all these kinds of, you know, changes that we talked about in the past, and we should probably do a refresher show
Yeah.
on. But nonetheless, there are targeted universities, and we've talked about Harvard and obviously Columbia is another one of those. And so there are a number of investigations into the ways that Columbia aren't, you know, doing what the Trump administration wants institutions of higher ed. This is, Tim, you like to call it a chilling effect.
Mhm.
This is one of those big institutions that we all look to in higher ed, like Harvard. Columbia is, you know, centrally located in a position of, you know, cultural influence, a
Mhm.
lot of political theory, a lot of economic theory coming out of Columbia, and opposition to Donald Trump. So this is like one of his perceived adversaries, even though universities are the site of free exchange of ideas.
Right.
So it's not necessarily like the university, you know, is as anti-Trump, although the sentiment likely is because he's anti-democratic as, you know, a kind of like leader that he is, and anti-human rights. But nonetheless, Colombia is, you know, under scrutiny. And as part of their being under scrutiny, right, the protests around the
Alri
conflict in Gaza and we talked about, we had witnessed some of those protests at the UW Madison when we were together at Madison, and certainly on our campuses around the country. Listeners, you probably are familiar with those kinds of protests around the country, as there is with many conflicts. Like, you know, part of democracy is nonviolent civil disobedience, is the right to gather and to say as people, hey, maybe this war or this kind of human right violation happening around the world isn't something we en masse support. So, you know, it's an attempt to, have a conversation sometimes where conversations can't be had. So again, we're not getting into the particulars because that was a messy
Mm.
political thing that we're kind of getting sorted out as we learn more. But the idea here is, as part of it, right? Jacob said Colombia didn't admit like, oh yeah, we're guilty. In fact, you know, allowing some of the protesting to happen was in fact, you know, supporting anti-Semitism and whatnot. And there certainly could have been bleed
Mhm.
overs into hate speech. Remember where we talked about free speech and hate speech sometimes get messy, and that is the university's responsibility to be the mediator of that kind of thing.
Right.
That is a governmental responsibility. So there may be some need to look at that more closely. I know every college campus is doing so as you know, they're conducting their policies around free speech. But the piece here I want to highlight, Tim, is when I come back full circle around to the negotiation tactic. It's like saying, well, I'm going to take this and I'm going to slap you with this, and we're going to investigate you for this, and we're going to charge you this. And then they're going to settle out of court, you know, $200 million. Say, you get $200 million, but give us $400 million back in grants. Right. And so Columbia's playing ball, right? That's how I read this. Columbia's playing ball. They're at the table of the art of the deal. And I'm making a joke around it because I'm not in a position to, you know, have the facts around how is this deal actually going down. But in my head, and as a reader, someone consuming what the news is saying, you know, multiple sources, not just liberal media or conservative media, right? But the news I'm getting, you know, it reminds me of like, this idea of like, we're gonna duke it out. We're really gonna slug it out until we land on something and we agree.
Mm.
And so, you know, Colombia pays $200 million settlement to say, okay, stop probing. And, you know, then the federal government says, okay, well, here's your 400 million in grants that we had frozen and taken away back. So it seems as though, and we'll follow this more closely, but it seems as though, you know, Columbia's up 200 grand in this. Like
Okay, yeah.
200 million. They're up 200 million. If they lost 200 million in a settlement, but got 400 million in grants back. So, it just seems like this sort of style of mediating that is absolutely about, keeping conflict going, making headlines, being sensationalized and loud about this. It is not about, resolve or what's
It's
best for
no,
students or faculty or,
yeah,
democracy.
yeah, and boy,
It's a
what
pissing
what
contest.
what I'm frustrated about, as you said, the chilling effect here, the payout, whatever you want to call it, the art of the deal, is to realize that the Trump administration, though currently, isn't going to stop the type of harassment, even though Colombia gets to say we didn't do anything wrong, but here's your 200 million. It starts setting this
Well,
example.
they didn't say they didn't do anything wrong. They
Okay.
just said,
Yeah.
settlement, let's get this
So,
done.
yeah, right.
Like,
It's just, make it go away. But
there's no admission of guilt with the
no admission
settlement,
of
but
guilt.
there's
Right.
no
Yeah. Okay.
denial of it either.
Right. Okay. But, how did we get here? How are we at the point? How does Trump have, the ability? How does any one politician create the ability to bring a Columbia to the table to do these things? And it's by pushing this narrative. What I want to say is that colleges are anti-right, they're woke, they're leftists, they're liberal bastions that in fact they use what happened in a lot of the protests around Gaza to further their anti-democratic, anti-freedom agenda. And as we're pointing out, they're what happened on those campuses, how did we get there? I'm I think there are issues where the campuses need to do a much better job. Now, I'm going to take it back to a bigger, broader context. Um, you get somebody from the right wing or the the middle ground or an alternative stance. You bring them to campus and you make sure that they have the right to show up and talk. And we do the same thing that we did for Bill Ayers. We gave him the ability to come in and talk, but we also gave everybody else the ability to protest, protest with freedom, and that preserved what the university is supposed to be for. Not a promotion of Bill Ayers and what Bill Ayers was doing, a conversation about the talk. It was not to promote and do away with people on the right at that time felt was their constitutional right to show up and protest. No, all of those things happened and they should happen on college campuses all the time. What's happening in these arts of the deals, as you're pointing out, is that actually the big loud message for lots of other institutions who don't have $200 million to pay out is that I think what you're going to see is is more of a leaning towards let's not do anything that
Yeah.
would potentially light the fire under this administration. And so there's going to be this kind of we're going to enforce mandatory neutrality. And this is where Howard's in. You can't be neutral on a moving train. And
Right.
and
Yeah.
and and so I'm coming back to this fear and realizing that okay, let's do a better job. And we talked about this too with Chris Rufo in the Manhattan, as I said, the contract on higher education. They use the fact that, there have been right wing and right ideologues across multiple campuses over the years who've been shouted down and moved out and stuff like that. And they use that happening to now push a new authoritarianism that says, okay, no freedom anymore. It's just a mess, Johnny. And I want our higher education institutions to continue to be places of freedom, disagreement, continued debate, and to know that those are safe places to express those opinions. Busted Pencils. We'll be right back. Woo! Yeah. One more segment. Busted Pencils, fully loaded education talk, educated educators talking education. Me, Dr. Tim Slekar, Dr. Johnny Lupinacci, Jacob, chairman of the boards, on a Saturday for all you civic media listeners out there listening live, and for everybody else, wherever you get your podcast. Thank you. Thank you for busting pencils. And don't worry, at the end of the show, Johnny will give you your mission, which is, I'm going to keep it though, keep it quiet, hold on to that. Johnny, I don't know, within all of this mess is, my fear of not having our institutions as places of valuable disagreement, even potentially to the point where I really am bothered by what so and so is saying, but allowing that to continue to happen, I just see that where we're headed in a direction that institutions are going to self-censor and actually enact more policies towards this attempt to be neutral. And that's going to make a campus a really boring place to be, and it's very antithetical to the mission of higher education, particularly public higher education in a democracy.
Well, Tim, let's be real. It's impossible to do. So it's a little bit of a BS maneuver. So I think you're on point when you were, before we went to the break, you were saying your worry is that, this is, a sign of, authoritarian government to control the free flow of information,
Mm.
right? And to control, in particularly around things like human rights and democracy. So I'm not going to pull any punches and say anything, that I don't firmly believe in. And I firmly believe that, like, these efforts, like you talked about, the chilling effect as it has on campuses, I think saying that like it will make campuses try and be neutral is like skirting around the issue of saying it's like they're just handing it over to like the Manhattan Report
Right.
to, to us, if we are to agree. And I'm not going to agree that like that in particular, that campuses are left leaning. I think they are great, a symbol of the free exchange of ideas, being a left leaning thinker on a campus where, I see all kinds of different thought. I see conservatives, I see, moderates, I see, left radicals, right radicals, but I see them all, engaged in, information and conversation, and in disagreeing in a learning environment that doesn't, cause or promote harm.
Mhm.
And Tim, so to say like we could strive for neutrality is just, kidding ourselves.
Yeah.
Like you said before, you can't be neutral on a moving train. You can't be still on a moving train, right? This is what it is. So my fear is, I share with you that it's really about, sending that chilling effect to say, if you're not sharing the ideas, and this is the sort of threat of like fascist authoritarian governments, is like, if you're not saying what supports what we want,
Mhm.
then it's not allowed.
Mhm.
And the tactic to get there is saying like, well, we have free speech, and it's it shouldn't be, it should be equal representation, which, Tim, we're going to come back to it
Oh,
again.
yeah, that's a whole other.
The false equivalency. You
Don't
don't give equal time to the false equivalency. So when we know something is harmful, when we
Mm.
know that something is bad, we're going to cover it as such, but we're also going to give space to the alternate views
Mhm.
proportionate to their existence and consensus,
Right.
right? And so that's really hard sometimes for people to understand, is that you don't give equal time,
Uh,
space, and resources to the false equivalency, right?
yeah,
And I'll use that example for our listener out there. Is like, what is he talking about? I'll use one like climate change, right? 99.9.99. I'm making up a number here, but it's a high one. Close to 100% of scientists agree on some level around like climate change and its impact on where we're headed. There's all kinds of nuances and differences in that, but they agree it's real. Climate change deniers are tiny little tiny little fraction
right.
of the scientific community out there, or even of like the informed community. I won't even put science on it because that's like a dog whistle for people who are saying, well, you're just a believer in science only. That's a problem now these days, unfortunately. I'm just saying in general, informed folks, there's a tiny population of that. There's a tiny little sliver that says, what if you're all wrong about this climate change thing? So that's important to recognize, to value it as a different opinion, different idea. But what you have to do is you can't give it equal time
Johnny, you can't give
to
the
the false
the
equivalence.
false equivalency. Let me make it really easy and we'll get to where we're supposed to do. Look, flat earthers, you don't get to show up on the same stage as round earthers. Okay. You get to have your own little convention in some crazy hotel. But now it's time for your moment of zen. Democracy comes from ordinary people seeing what they have in common and seeing what they are lacking. When ordinary people get together, they put their energy together.
Thanks for listening to today's Saturday broadcast. And if you want more Busted Pencils, just go on over to Apple, Spotify, and search Busted Pencils. And you can always get at us at civicmedia.com or on the website bustedpencils.com. Remember, you can always find great Busted Pencils content every Monday for homeroom, Wednesdays for class and session, and on Fridays for producer Jacob's Choice.
Woo.
And of course, Pencil Busters, you can always tune in like you did today for Saturday's broadcast, 3 p.m. Central Time across all the Civic Media networks for 1 hour of your favorite blue-collar scholars, Tim and Johnny, and keep busting pencils.